Before we get started with today's conversation with C. Anderson, the author of Faith to Move Mountains and editor at missionarylife.org, also DMMs, Frontier Missions.com. We had a great conversation, but I want to point out a resource that's coming in just a few days. We're talking about getting started in disciple-making movements. Even if you're busy, don't speak the language well, and don't have any money. This is a webinar, a resource that's taking place, and you can find that at YWAMFM.teachable.com. That's YWAMFM.teachable.com. You want to check out that resource, sign up. The link is available now, and I'm really excited to promote this event and this conversation because it's talking about how to see disciple-making movements, how you can be used by God to impact your sphere of influence and beyond. Check that out today.
Missions Pulse. Know God's heart, join His mission. This podcast is powered by Within Reach Global. Subscribe, watch, and listen on YouTube today. Visit missionspulse.com.
Welcome to the show. I'm so excited to see you here today, C. Anderson.
It's great to be here.
Thank you. I'm excited for this conversation because I know you've had this almost like a legacy life in missions. I mean, there's a lot of things taking place in the world today with missionary attrition. People come overseas cross-culturally, their first term, a year and a half, 2 years. Number of different reasons, they return home. Meanwhile, this is the 29th year for you on the mission field.
Yeah, that's right. It's been a good run.
A good run. We'll call that a marathon, right? Not exactly the sprint.
We still got a lot ahead.
Yeah. But not only that, you were actually born on the mission field as well.
That's correct, yeah. Yeah, I was born in the country of Nigeria.
Were you? Okay.
And I was born actually in the middle of a civil war, a war called the Biafran War. And we were evacuated when I was a year old.
Wow.
But then we went back to Ghana when I was in kindergarten.
Okay.
So then spent my childhood in Ghana and then in Liberia. And then again, we're evacuated when I was 13 and went back to the States, which is where I did high school and college.
I see. Because at that time, Liberia, Monrovia was going through a civil war as well, right?
That's right. There were several coups
second,
and then
third.
Yeah, several takeovers and things that happened, and it became quite violent. So
okay, I have to pause you there then and say, who are your parents?
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
Tell me about your parents because they're going to places that are in today's world, especially. I think I could talk about the West, North America, let's say. We oftentimes mistake that comfort and security is a primary concern of Jesus for his church, where in fact he says, if they persecuted me, they're going to persecute you. That's a promise from Jesus. But your parents are saying, comfort, security, not really my deal. Yeah,
indeed. My parents are Jerry and Maxine Falley, and they were Assembly of God missionaries, career missionaries. They spent many, many years, their whole career on the mission field. It seemed like everywhere we went, there was some sort of conflict or turmoil that happened. We used to joke about that, but my mom is just an amazing woman. She would write and say, yeah, I'm baking a cake and there's another coup today, or there's a war or bombs going off. And that's the kind of heritage I grew up with. But when I was 13 and we were evacuated from Liberia, it was actually quite a traumatic exit.
I can imagine, yeah.
It was a hard exit. I was at a very kind of sensitive time in my life, adolescent. And we went back to the States and had a very tough re-entry into America as well, going into public middle school, as a teenager. I can only imagine.
You come from where, Monrovia?
From Monrovia, having come out of, a fairly severe coup where my friends' parents were executed,
Really?
That kind of thing. So it was rather traumatic exit. And actually, David, at that point, I came out of that experience saying, I never want to live someplace that's not safe.
I was actually going to ask you if that even kind of broke the final straw for your decision to be involved in missions, or saying, never do I want to be, as an MK, never do I want to be a missionary. Happens a lot.
I'm not sure I said never do I want to be a missionary, but I did say I want to live someplace safe.
Yeah.
I don't want to have to go through this kind of a lifestyle. I don't want to do this. And it wasn't until I was in college, I was studying literature at the University of Minnesota. And my ambition was to be a Rhodes Scholar. I was into academics, and it was, at that point when I kind of got a travel itch, missionary kids. It had been a long time since I'd traveled, and I thought, wow, I think I'd love to go to Asia, And
You'd been to Asia before?
I hadn't.
No, okay.
And so I thought, well, I'll go to Asia, but maybe I should go on a missions trip. Then my church would kick in and help pay for it.
Yeah.
Really great motivation.
But there's the thinking of an MK right there,
action. But that mission trip changed my life.
Where did you go?
I came to Thailand, actually. Thailand and Singapore.
Wow.
And it was here in Thailand that God called me to missions. And I knew as an adult, I had seen the unreached as a child, been exposed to the need, but as an adult, a young adult, I saw for the first time the need of the unreached, and it blew me away. And I went back knowing there's no way I can just live my nice little life and know that there are millions who have never had a chance to hear the gospel. So that was where my calling came from.
Wow, that's amazing. And here we are in Thailand.
Here we are in Thailand, yeah.
Still. Now, I'm always amazed and interested in these moments that I call divine intersections.
Sure.
You grew up, being exposed to a completely different life, I think, than most people, your peers. They don't have these experiences or similar stories to tell like you have. But then later on, you say, that's where I got my missions call. I'm just very interested in how the Holy Spirit moves and touches a person to make it real in your life. As you experienced the call of God, I mean, even as a MK, as a missionary kid, years later, you're 18, 19, 20 on that first mission trip to Asia?
Yeah, I was 19. Mm-hmm.
Okay. But you say that's where you got your missionary call. Mm-hmm. It's kind of striking to me because you're an MK. You grew up in in Ghana and Liberia, Nigeria. How do people find their own missionary call?
Yeah, well, I think
not necessarily missionary call, I should say. How do they fulfill their call that God gave them, I should say.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I think it's different for everyone. Mm-hmm. I think it's a little bit dangerous when we start saying it happens this way.
Yeah, come to Thailand. That's the only way.
Or you have to go on a short-term missions trip, or, those kinds of formulas. I think God is, he loves to work differently from whatever box we try to put him in.
So it's kind of a cheat question anyway.
Yeah, but I think there are general principles. I think God does set us up for opportunities for him to really engage with us. And when we're in a place where we're stretching ourselves, we're out of our comfort zone, we're willing to hear him differently, I think he'll use that, But for me, in my calling, it wasn't because I had pure motives.
Sure.
It was, I was just wanted to explore the world, and I love that about God. I love how he knows how to get us to our destiny. He knows how to put us in those positions and even use wrong motivations to get us to where he really wants us to go and what he has for us. But there's a responsiveness to that has to be happening in us as well.
I think this whole conversation, you're going to be pointing us back to that kind of precarious walk back into discomfort, insecurity. But I do like how you point out, really you could say you were just in the right place at the right time. I just shared before we went live how scripture for our 2019, my wife and I, and within Reach Global, our organization, was Isaiah 26:12. All that we have accomplished, you have done for us. I'm trying and working and doing all my efforts, and sometimes I'm just wasting time, because I don't know what else to do or how to do something better, whether it be missions or family or etc. And all my feeble efforts, God takes them and say, good job, but I did everything. It's like that kid, and I've shared this story, who goes to his grandpa's house, and grandpa says, we're going to build a fence, and parents leave for the day and leave their grandson and grandfather are building this fence. The grandfather gives the grandson a block of wood, a hammer, and a nail, and said, I want you to hammer this into this wood. And all day, this young child is hammering this nail into the wood, and grandfather builds the fence. And mom and dad come home, and the son says, I built a fence. I built a fence with grandpa. And you could almost see grandfather just kind of laughing to himself, thinking, yeah, he really helped a lot. It seems like that's what you're describing, the long-winded version. Sorry about that tangent.
No, that's okay. Yeah, and that's very similar to a story I often tell that describes the same kind of thing. There was a time when our daughter Stephanie, we have 3 children, all born on the mission field, and she was about 6 years old. And usually we would celebrate Thanksgiving and Christmas in traditional American ways, kind of help our kids adjust to what Western holidays were like. And so we were making an apple pie, and she wanted to help me, and so we made this apple pie together, and I would measure the 1 cup of flour and let her hold it and put it into the bowl. And, we made it together. And then, on Thanksgiving Day, it was like, look at the pie Steffi made, my daughter. Yeah. And she was so thrilled that she got to make that pie. Yeah. And yet it was Mom who made the pie,
exactly.
And it's so true, similar to your illustration, that we work with God.
Yeah.
And he does the heavy lifting, but he invites us into this partnership in missions of the great things that he wants to do through us if we'll let him. And that's so faith building, because I look at myself and think, what do I have to offer? And yet I look back on 29 years in missions and say, wow, it's just amazing what God has done, and I've had the privilege of partnering with him on.
Yes, and that's really the gist of what we're trying to get people to see.
Right.
When you know God's heart, it's inevitable that you join his mission.
Yeah.
Well, let's kind of change gears here, because you, I want you to introduce yourself now beyond your backdrop. But now, here you are, author of this book, Faith to Move Mountains, Stirring Our Faith to Believe for Movements Among the Unreached. I can see this passion that you have for unreached people groups. You also run missionarylife.org, DMMs or DMMs, frontiermission.com, and these websites that are very compelling and encouraging for not only missionaries, but everyone who wants to take part in God's this epic mandate of fulfilling the Great Commission. How did you come into this role now of webmaster / inspirational blogger / speaker?
Yeah, thanks. Well, it's been a journey.
Yeah.
And a bit of a surprise, actually, not something that I would have seen myself doing. But yeah, I worked with YWAM Frontier Missions for many years as a church planner first myself, together with my husband, and started a movement in a South Asian country. And then trained national church planners. We were doing that for many years, coaching and working with them hands-on and in the field. And then a number of years ago, I handed over a role I'd been in for many years, providing leadership to our Frontier Missions work in South Asia. Handed that over to a national leader, which was wonderful.
Yeah, wonderful, but a sense of a loss. Right? Was it?
No, it was actually just a wonderful baton pass.
I'm glad to hear, because that is I would consider a pinnacle of the missionary effort.
Oh, yeah. Well, it
was
was
over something to local indigenous leadership, right?
Yeah. Well, that is always the goal,
Yeah.
And so
Wow,
for me, it was something to really celebrate. And the person I handed over to is doing a phenomenal job.
Awesome.
And the work continues to grow. So, and of course, I'm still involved in a coaching role there. But no, it was a wonderful handover. Like you said, they aren't always, and there can be a sense of loss. But after that, I took a sabbatical for 3 months and just really asked the Lord, what do you have next? What is on your agenda? And he spoke to me then about writing and blogging and continuing to expand my platform in an online presence.
Yeah.
And that was not on my radar at all.
I'll pause you right there, because, I think for most people serving overseas, cross-culturally, call them missionaries, call them global kingdom workers, whatever you call them, people have different preferences.
Yeah.
That's not really a conversation, growing my online presence or becoming, first of all, they have many anonymity concerns to begin with, because they work in closed or restricted or difficult access countries. But there comes a season in your life where God is calling you you've been this practitioner for many years.
Right.
Now multiply yourself through the encouragement and experience you've witnessed.
Exactly. And, God spoke to me about 10 years ago when I was on a retreat with my husband. And I talk about that in the book, Faith to Move Mountains.
Okay.
I had just taken that new role of leading the Frontier Missions work for South Asia. I was intimidated. It was going from leading about 50 people to leading 500 people.
Wow.
It was a big change. It was responsibility for a region that has a billion unreached people, so I was intimidated. I was scared. And I was like, God, what do you want to do? And the Lord spoke to me from Luke chapter 19, the parable of the minas. And when he spoke that word, the story is well known to all of us, about how the master called his 10 servants, gave them each a mina, and told them to put it to work until he would return from the trip where he went to receive his kingdom. And when the Lord spoke that word, I knew he was speaking to me about multiplication, and that now was the time to really radically pursue the multiplication we'd been talking about for so many years, but not necessarily seeing. And that God really wanted us in faith to go after that multiplication and to see the release of many, many movements. And so multiplying, seeing more disciples making disciples, seeing more movements launched, from that point really became a growing passion. It already had been a part of my work. I'd been very hands-on in that, but seeing in faith that become reality. And we've seen 19 movements launched in the last few years, and been able to partner with people and also coach people to movements. And that's been just super exciting as well. So the whole online presence thing, I felt like the Lord just said, I want the excellent training that you guys have been doing to be available to more people. You can't go everywhere. And many people need to be able to have this available to them. So.
I'm glad you weren't one of those who took the gift that God gave you, buried it, saved it for later. Instead, you put it to work, you invested it. So because of that, we have to talk about a upcoming exciting event that's taking place just in a couple days here, January 15, right?
Right, yeah.
Now, tell us about this. You're calling it a webinar, or what are you calling?
So we will be running a few webinars.
Okay.
At that time, some free training that will be available on the 15th and 16th. But on that day and through those webinars, we'll be launching the new registration will be opening for the course that I mentioned. We ran this course back in June and had about 63 students go through the course. It's a very introductory course on how to get started in disciple-making movements, even if you're busy, can't speak the language well, and have no money. Right?
Okay, you're talking to a lot of cross-cultural missionaries, but it's not only for missionaries.
No.
Okay.
No.
How are people going to benefit? When you say disciple-making movements, or someone called disciple multiplication movements, someone call it CPM, church planting movements, right? Kind of some synonymous meanings.
Yeah.
What does that mean? I mean, isn't it just enough to tell a friend or tell a grocery store worker or share the gospel one-on-one individually? Why disciple-making movements or multiplication aspect?
Yeah, well, it really goes back to the Great Commission and how Jesus commanded us to go and make disciples of all nations and then to baptize them and teach them to obey everything that I've commanded you. So right there in the Great Commission, we find the multiplication factor.
I see, yeah.
Because Jesus told them to make disciples and then teach those disciples to obey his commands. And one of them was that they make disciples. So
disciples who make disciples.
Disciples, inherent in the Great Commission is the command to multiply disciples. And that we all, if we're following Jesus and we consider ourselves a disciple, we all have a responsibility to engage in disciple making. And as we do that, often we will see this organic kind of multiplication that begins to happen. One of my passions and things I really believe is that every disciple can start disciple-making groups.
Wow. I love the optimism in your voice, because oftentimes, especially in the Western world, and American, let's say, I could talk about America. I think I'm American. Well, I hold an American passport. Haven't lived there for quite some time.
I hear you. Me too.
But we see the pastor, right? Or you see leadership who are up on the stage. Everyone else, laywomen, don't really open their mouths a lot except to sing, worship time. And then it's you don't see that every member is a minister in action a lot of times, I think, in the Western church. Whereas I think in our context, church planting, church structures are they're either house church led, or they're small groups, or every member has an opportunity to be a minister. The optimism in your voice is telling me, regardless of where you're from, you can be a discipler who makes disciples.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think there's more and more of a hunger and passion for that in the West than has maybe been there in the past.
Yeah, okay.
I think, it really comes back to the priesthood of all believers, David, that when Jesus came, and this is something that I love to teach on, is when Jesus came and he died on that cross, the curtain was torn. And every believer had access, and something radically changed. And we moved from a Levitical system where you had to go through a priest, and only the priest had access to God, to every believer having the same access to the Father.
Wow.
And, the priesthood of all believers is something that is so vital. It's something Jesus died and paid a price for us to have. And yet when we just attend church and we go back to a priesthood system where only the pastor can do the work of the ministry, we're really stuck in an Old Testament system rather than the New Testament system Jesus died to provide. Every believer has the same authority, the same responsibility to make disciples, and to start groups of disciples that start to obey his commands, that start to listen and learn, and then to train those people to make more disciples.
Yeah.
And it's our privilege. We have that authority, and we have that responsibility as well to engage in disciple making as ordinary believers, as missionaries, as ministers, whatever role you find yourself in.
I so appreciate your graciousness in saying this, because there's a couple ways to tackle this issue, right? One could be a little vehement, but I love how you're pointing people in the direction of, yes, every member is a minister. As you talk about DMMs, disciple making or disciple multiplication movements, you've seen that video recently, Sheep Among Wolves by
Yes,
Dalton
I have.
Thomas.
Yeah.
It was FAI, Frontier Alliance International, I think, is the group that put it out.
Sure.
Sheep Among Wolves. It's free. It's full-length feature film on YouTube.
Right.
Volume 2, by the way, is the most recent one, and riveting one. Cinematography is excellent as well. But it's basically the story of, as we know, Iran, right? This nuclear charged nation or country. Meanwhile, the undercurrents of which is a nominal Islam that is giving way to the birth of disciple-making movements, Christians rising up in Iran. And it tackles how and why. How is this happening? They focus on DMM, disciple-making movements. But I like also how you're saying you don't have to be in Iran or a closed or restricted access country. You don't have to be a missionary who's sent to the far-off corners of the world. You can do this. And immediately, as I think of people who are saying, wait, making disciples, does that mean I go through a 12-week discipleship course? What is discipleship? You're pointing to a relational aspect, I think, that makes it feasible for people to join.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's, disciple making, we can make it so complicated.
Yeah.
We can make it into a program. And disciple making is really just sharing your faith with the people around you. And then as they come to Christ, taking that responsibility, not just to bring them to church, but to invest in their lives on a regular basis and to train them to be a follower of Jesus who also obeys his command to reach others in their network and in their circle. And that really is the foundational core of what happens in a disciple-making movement. Without that understanding that every disciple makes disciples, you don't see movements take place.
Yeah.
And when that's there, and the understanding of the priesthood of all believers, when every local believer is able to be empowered with authority to make disciples, they're given that. They're not held back from doing that by different restrictions, or you have to be ordained to do this or that, or when they're really empowered and given that authority, it's amazing what God does through ordinary people.
On that note, you have to sign up for Getting Started in Disciple Making Movements. You're wondering where to go. The link is in the descriptions. It's everywhere. We're pasting it in this video. I'm looking forward to a lot more people joining that. Can you tell me some maybe real life examples? I think maybe a lot of people they can hear this theoretical aspect, right, of disciple making movements and how does it really work? And you can kind of feel it because you've been there in East Asian nations, like you mentioned, and growing up perhaps in Africa, on the African continent. What are some kind of real life testimonies, not of walking someone through the pages of a discipleship course, but seeing someone grow in their they're just being discipled and then becoming themselves one who makes other disciples?
Sure, yeah. And well, two examples come to mind. I'm going to give examples of women in particular.
I love that, yes.
Because I think many people don't realize that God is using them dramatically, and the film brings that
That's
out.
right. Sheep Among Wolves focuses on women as the spear tip of the Iranian church.
Yeah, which is a wonderful thing to observe and highlight. Many times we devalue women's roles in disciple making and in multiplication of the church.
Look back historically and biblically.
So there's
the Samaritan woman,
the
discipler,
Samaritan woman,
right? I mean, there's
Lydia,
filled.
whose house was where the church, was born.
That's right.
So many examples that we find from Scripture. But let me give two examples. One from the recent course that the cohort we ran in June. There was a lady from the UK who was wanting to start a disciple-making movement in her area. And going through the course, she learned a lot about how to create an extraordinary prayer plan. Prayer is huge in the launching of a disciple-making movement, how to mobilize a team of other people to join with her. She's somebody who works a normal job, 40 hours a week. She's doing it as a lay person,
Wow.
but passionate to reach her community. She's in a rural community in the UK. And began to formulate her vision, put that together, really going after that in prayer, and then looking for the person of peace, which is what we talk about in the course. How do you find the person of peace? And for a long time, she was like, what do I do? I've been praying,
it seems so
I've been
ethereal,
going out.
Right? The person of peace.
The
Who
person
could they
of
be?
peace, who are they?
Yeah.
But just about at the very last week of the course, I think it was, she went out and she was sharing, and she found her person of peace.
Wow.
And
They were just a friend she'd come across perhaps in a store or shopping along the way?
someone in her neighborhood.
I see.
That she built a relationship with and was sharing with. And
just to debunk the person of peace mystery, right?
exactly, yeah. And I had shared in a blog actually about the importance of giving the invitation. So when we share a story, which the Discovery Bible Studies encourage you to share a story, we were teaching about how to share your testimony, but to be sure to invite.
Yes.
At
don't
the
stop
end of,
short
don't
of that
stop
invitation.
short of that. So I'd written a blog about that. She'd been inspired by
Good.
that, and she
Cool.
invited at the end of sharing with this couple, and they agreed to start a Discovery Bible Study group in their home. And things have taken off. She's been able to start her first multiplication group and getting started. And I'm so excited for her as to
Yes.
what the future holds. But that's really what the course takes you from, kind of point A, very practically, step by step. What do you do if you have that passion to reach your area, to reach your region, your own people group or another people group? It is, great for missionaries, for pastors and leaders, but it is also for the layperson who's hungry to fulfill the Great Commission.
And the course you're
area.
talking about, again, just getting started in disciple-making movements. Is that right?
That's right. Getting started in disciple-making movements.
And then the tagline.
Yeah, even if you're busy, can't speak the language well, and have no money.
I like how you point first. Your first story is in a supposed post-Christian society or environment. You're telling me in Europe, supposedly the post-Christian society, and America's heading in many ways that direction, right? Disciple-making movements are starting, and then you've alluded to Iran and disciple-making movements in the most unassuming of places. God is still interested in growing his church through the most unassuming of misfits. I'm speaking to myself, homeschool kid who got my good enough degree, my GED. It suddenly becomes so practical and feasible that disciple-making movements are just people gathering telling their sphere of influence, their friends and their friends and their friends, and suddenly you kind of see the sparks of a mini revival, perhaps even bigger, and then lives are being transformed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really think one of the characteristics that we see in disciple-making movements is they are led by ordinary people. I was talking to another one of my students from the course, and he had recently, he wanted to observe some disciple-making movement. So he had observed one in Burma.
Okay.
And in Myanmar, and he went there and was just seeing what was happening. And he said to me, see, I am just amazed. The guy who's leading this, he's a vegetable seller. How can a vegetable seller be leading hundreds of churches?
That's right.
And yet it's happening worldwide. And disciple-making movements are often led by really ordinary people, people who work jobs, people who are, not necessarily trained in a seminary, or they don't have a degree in theology.
That's
but
right.
They're passionate about obeying Jesus and teaching others how to do the same. And it's leading to rapid multiplication.
When you say that, it reminds me of what's taking place in Thailand right now. I mean, we have many decades and decades, 100 years of missionary presence in Thailand. 65 million Thai people in this country. And there are 92%, I think, who are staunch Buddhist adherents. Suddenly in Phetchabun in central Thailand, there's this massive revival that's taking place, not led by missionaries, but led by a local guy who was an insurance agent. He was just an insurance agent, working a 9 to 5. Got a passion for sharing the gospel and came up with a strategy. I think that's what you're pointing to, that strategic aspect of seeing, starting with the end in mind, right? What is the end goal I want to achieve? When you get started in disciple-making movements, start from the end in mind and say, what do I want to see in my neighborhood, my family, in my region, in my sphere of influence? And then, as he took steps, there have been thousands who've made,
so
decisions for Christ. Yeah, this is unlike anything that's ever happened in Thailand before.
I know. We're so thrilled, and more is coming.
That's right, yeah.
More is coming.
Yeah.
I really believe breakthroughs are happening in Thailand, and this is the season for an amazing growth, that it won't just be one movement we hear of, but many, many movements happening here. But what you say is so key. It is ordinary people who are embracing a call to be a disciple maker and to multiply disciples who know how to train others. And you talk about strategy, but I think it's important to note that when we say strategy, we're talking really about simplifying, not creating some extravagant, complicated strategy that you need to go through, a year learning, It's really going back to the simple gospel and to using very, very simple methods of training people to be disciples who multiply. And, that goes back to my second story that I was going
excited to hear. Sorry, I keep perpetuating it with all these in-between rabbit trails.
But I think it's a good illustration of that. So when we were working in another South Asian country, we had been involved in a local church there, and the pastor preached every week, and I got to know his wife and become friends with her, and she'd never done any Bible college or seminary, and but as I got to know her, she had this hunger to be used of God in ministry, and so I started to talk to her about how, God can use you. You don't have to go to seminary. You don't have to do all this. All you have to do is be willing to let God use you. So I started discipling her and encouraged her to start a group of women that she would disciple. And she was quite scared and intimidated. But what I would do is on Saturday nights or Friday nights, because church met in that country on Saturdays. But on Friday nights, I would meet with her and we would do a simple Bible study, go through a story. And then we would practice it together. And then on Saturday, she would teach it to the other women. And I was present, but I kept my mouth shut, just watched her. And she would lead the Bible study. And if she made any mistakes, I would, help her later. But she was the upfront leader. And I was discipling from behind and training her how to be a disciple maker, how to lead this group of disciples. And then the women in that group were challenged to start their own groups. And that was just another example of how a woman who didn't believe she had much to offer, by having somebody mentor her and just walk with her and be willing to be behind,
Yes.
rather than being the teacher up front, let her emerge as the leader of that group and be seen as that. But it started to multiply, and we saw many, many women in that church grow as disciples and disciple makers.
For those who are watching and listening, I hope they're taking heart and listening to your words. That you, as that kind of behind the scenes, not in the limelight, not at the forefront of this movement, right? The foreign savior. We often have that savior complex in the mission world.
Yeah.
In fact, you're kind of behind the scenes. I'm sure none of those ladies, very few of them even knew that you were discipling the upfront woman.
That's right.
Right? They probably had no idea and still have no idea.
Yeah.
And therefore, it was a very indigenous or local-led movement. You had a part to play. It wasn't because of you inciting this whole movement. The Holy Spirit did that.
Right.
But I appreciate you taking this step back and empowering the other person. I think to me, it seems like I was also mentored by a group of men, one Danish, Dutch, American, and Irish when I first arrived in China. And our missionary motto of our apostolic missionary group was, "We have done so much with so little for so long, we can now do anything with nothing." That was our missionary
I love that.
motto.
That's great.
Done so much with so little for so long, we can now do anything with nothing. And these are the kind of guys who walked me through how to go about reaching unreached, how to be a man who leads well, how to be a man who is a good husband, father, etc. They taught me how to be a man. And there was nothing special necessarily about these men, but they were willing to just invest. And so for those who are listening and might be like that woman, a little bit scared to be that main upfront person, actually, in retrospect, for all those women, they'll just consider her a good friend who sowed into their lives and propelled them on to their own ministries. You have to think with the end in mind. And I like also how it's not this big strategic whiteboard, markers everywhere, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right?
Yeah.
That relational aspect will surpass all these strategies you may have. However, you still got to take the course by C. Anderson, Getting Started in Disciple Making
I think the course really helps you walk step by step in that process.
Yeah.
And I was going to mention, when we talk about your vision, one of the things we talk about in the first module is dreaming with God. And I think, sometimes our own dreams of what we think we could do are so limited. I know mine are, when I look realistically at what I'm capable of, I'm thinking about something small. But when I start to dream with God and listen to him and what's on his heart to do, and when I think of it, like we talked about earlier in the podcast, of a partnership with him, that he's wanting to do incredible things through us.
Yeah.
He's wanting to do incredible things. He's looking for those who are willing. And we start to dream with him. And Faith to Move Mountains, the book, talks about that as well. He wants to put into our hearts faith to believe him for multiplication kinds of dreams. I think that's another tendency we have. We tend to think about addition growth. What can I do if I were to lead this person to the Lord, or that person to the Lord, or I was to influence this family or start this ministry? But really, when we start to think multiplication and we start dreaming with God, it's incredible what he can do through ordinary people like us. And such a privilege to work with him on his multiplication dreams,
I recently was talking to Matthew Ellison. He's the founder and president of 1615 Ministries, co-author of When Everything Is Missions. And he was talking about how when Jesus sent people out, it wasn't just go and make disciples. When you stop right there, okay, there was a comma after his go and make disciples, or no comma actually, of all nations. Right. He said when you remove the object from that verb, go and make disciples of whom? Of all nations, right. We gut the mandate. Use strong words. We gut the mandate.
Wow.
When you only think it's about making disciples. There's that addition. One here, one there. Maybe they'll believe. Family next door might hear the gospel. But when you think about of all nations, you see the biggerness, the picture of every nation, and then you continue with your thought of teaching them, discipling them, baptizing them. This is one who makes disciples, who make disciples, who make disciples, multiplication factor. I think God's heart is for culture, for language, for color. Revelation 7:9, almost every episode of Missions Pulse, I point to Revelation 7:9 because it seems to me the culmination of this story, right? I mean, every nation, tongue, tribe, people standing before the throne of God, worshiping, white, dressed in white, palm branches. Basically, every culture, every ethno-linguistic tribe is standing there, and God's receiving worship from every kind of multiple facet of this diamond of the he created, right? He doesn't want just one single facet of worship arising in English with, laser lights and fog machines, as we know in the West. He wants to see multiple facets and views and visions of peoples and culture. And he deserves the praise from every nation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, that's one of the reasons why I believe disciple-making movements are so important in missions today as we approach the end of the Great Commission. We're within reach. We're the title of your...
I know. I love how some people... I love how you mentioned that it's within reach. That's why we named our organization Within Reach Global.
Yeah,
kind of
I
see
love
the
that.
glass half
Great
full.
name,
Glass half full rather than empty kind of idea.
Yeah, I mean, we are closer than ever before, but I really believe disciple-making movements is critical as we look at the completion of seeing every people group have their own expression of church. And one of the things we see in a disciple-making movement is though there may be different people groups worshiping together in different groups, but there are streams because disciple-making movements, they multiply relationally within what we call the oikos. So you have your group of friends and family, and most of those people are going to be in your own people group.
Yes, I see what you mean.
So as those streams start to continue to grow, we see multiplication happen along those lines, and it naturally becomes indigenous.
Yes.
If we are careful not to bring in Western things that will, Western buildings or music or language can be an issue.
Get rid of all the ethnic musical instruments and bringing guitar and piano.
Yeah, especially for the big celebration meetings, we need to be careful of that. But when people meet in homes, you tend to use your own language.
Yep, I see what you're saying. And your own personality, characteristics, style.
Exactly. Those things, indigeneity comes quite naturally in a home group as opposed to in a broader, bigger meeting. And so, I think it's part of the expression of Revelation 7:9, like you talked about, that we look at how to multiply these house church movements and DMMs.
Well, you're saying the Great Commission, the fulfillment of the Great Commission. By the way, I have to point out the 51% of churchgoers in America as of March 2018, according to Barna Research, they did this research, 51% of churchgoers in America did not know what the Great Commission was. So I should pause and say the Great Commission, that is Matthew 28, Jesus sending out, like C. Anderson here has been sharing about, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and Son, just teaching them, etc. Matthew 28. You could also see it in, say, Acts 1:8. You'll be my disciples or my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. So you're talking about the Great Commission, the fulfillment of the Great Commission. It is within reach. You go back to the turn of the 20th century, let's say, and the byword or the watchword of the student volunteer movement, the evangelization of the world in this generation. Is that really possible? Are we really able to, or is the fulfillment of the Great Commission that every people has an opportunity to hear the gospel really within reach today?
I believe it is, and yet I think there are some strategic shifts that must take place in our mind. And in the way we do church globally, if that's to happen. They're happening. Those shifts are taking place. I'm encouraged by that. But one of them is what we've been talking about here, that every disciple embraces their role as a disciple maker. I think
It sounds too simple.
It sounds simple, and yet how many people don't?
Yes,
How many people
absolutely.
consider it enough to be a church member?
Sure.
I attend church on Sunday, that's enough, and they don't take on that responsibility to engage in disciple making and see that they can,
And no offense to those who just attend church, but how boring. Really, there's so much more in this epic adventure that God created for you than attending church on Sunday morning.
There is so much more, and I think that it brings such spiritual vitality to us
Absolutely.
when we engage in that.
Yes.
But I think without that, then I'm not sure, David,
Yes.
because if we look at the millions that remain,
exactly.
2/3 of the world that still doesn't have a gospel witness.
When you say 2/3 of the world, you're talking nearly 1 billion people, or some would say, 2 billion people.
Yeah.
2 billion?
Yeah, well, they say 2/3 of the world is without the gospel,
Okay.
and then 1/3 of the world is without anyone even close to them who could share the gospel. So they're really in that unreached category.
Yes.
So as we look at fulfilling the Great Commission and reaching all peoples, reaching all people groups, but also making the gospel accessible to all.
Yeah.
We look at that task without every disciple embracing their role and their responsibility to make disciples. I'm not sure that'll happen. I think it's a key, critical shift, and that's why I'm so passionate about promoting this, that people would embrace, I can make disciples. I'm busy. I don't have money. Maybe I don't even speak other languages, but I can make disciples.
Amen.
And
Yes.
that's what that course is really all about, is to help missionaries who, missionaries, we get really busy.
Yes.
We're busy with lots of good things.
Or
that-
just simply trying to visa in your country.
trying to get your visa, trying to buy
That'll-
groceries and vegetables, but how can we be more missional
Yes.
in what we do?
Yeah.
Actually,
Not exhaust yourself with all this work, but naturally, relationally make disciples.
right.
I agree with you that yes, the evangelization of the world in this generation, they said that over 120 years ago, but it is within reach. I do believe it's possible, but massive paradigm shifting needs to take place. And I also like how something else you're very passionate about, the rise of this global South church, the complexion of missionaries. We're talking a lot, and I think people are hearing it through the lens of this Caucasian or Western missionary, right? The American or North American or European, or the Western church going to other nations. Whereas, in fact, the complexion of global missionaries is the former mission fields are now a missionary sending force. Look at Brazil, look at Mongolia, look at China, look at all throughout Africa. And so this rise of the global South missionary looks very different from the historical version of a missionary. They have different needs. They have different styles. I'm married into the Filipino culture, which could be considered part of the global South.
Sure.
And the way that they do discipleship in the Philippines is unlike anything I've ever experienced in my American upbringing. Sadly, I did not experience discipleship like my wife did. We'd walk into her church, she would point at people and say, "That's my disciple, there's my disciple, I'm her discipler." I mean, there was this hierarchy that kind of scares us, I think, in the West. But everyone knew their place. It was so rich and vibrant because everyone was integrated and it was growing. And my wife alone was able to kind of start 10 different cell group, now became churches in different university campuses throughout Manila. Naturally, because she knew her place as a member, every member a minister. So I don't know. I say all that because I know you're passionate kind of this global South, new complexion of the missionary task force growing.
Absolutely. And it's so encouraging. And I think when we look at within reach, are we within reach? I think we're looking at the global South because they do more naturally think this way.
Communally.
Communally and relationally.
Yes.
And there's all that. And yet there is still the challenge of that mindset shift. Which is there in the global South and that they face. But I think many more people from Asia, Africa, Latin America are embracing the fact that we do have a missions call as
Yes,
well.
yeah, that's exciting.
The Great Commission is for us. It's
Yeah.
not just to us.
Correct.
And missionarylife.org is the blog that I write that is focused on the Global South and really written for the African, Asian, or Latin American missionary.
Awesome. Okay.
I've worked with people from those cultures for years in missions, and I feel like I have a good understanding as to some of their needs and things that they encounter. And so, yeah, there's a lot of blogs out there that are good for Western missionaries, but I feel like there's a need for somebody to really address the kinds of issues and frustrations they face. They face greater visa challenges than we do, say, as an American. Into many countries, it's easier for us to get a visa because of government relations and different things. Some places harder. But, visa challenges, financial challenges, member care, support raising, marriage on the field, raising kids on the field. But the missionarylife.org addresses those issues, especially for the Global South missionary, though it's a helpful blog for any missionary.
Yeah, I found it helpful as well. So again, we'll do a couple of shameless plugs here. And specifically, if people who are watching or listening know of Global South Missionary, again, just to reiterate, Asian, African, South Central, Latin American person who's crossing cultures or not, working perhaps in their own spheres of influence, but a lot of times cross-culturally, and even cross-geographically or cross-lingually. If you know someone like that, share the missionarylife.org. That will encourage and inspire them. Also, I'd like to point out again your other website, DMMs Frontier Missions, with an S, right?
Right.
.com. DMMs Frontier Missions.com. I so appreciate not only the content, because it is quality, inspirational content that helps people thrive on mission, but also the imagery. Okay. It's beautiful, well done, share worthy. I can't share something, even if it's excellent content and it's so ugly, it makes me cringe. I just can't share it. But I'll be happy to share anything from missionarylife.org, etc. So I really appreciate you listening to the voice of the Holy Spirit as he spoke to you maybe a decade ago, to walk into this direction of multiplication rather than continued addition. I shouldn't say a continued addition, but simple addition. It seems like God is using you well beyond what you even realize at this present time.
Oh, well, I'm excited about the future and what God has, and he's a multiplication God.
Yeah.
It's inherent. I was just reading the other day in Genesis 1, he said, multiply and fill the earth. He's a multiplication God. He loves multiplication.
He loves math.
He does. I don't, but he does. I love multiplication and seeing that happen, though. But he wants us to multiply. He designed us to multiply.
Yeah.
And definitely as disciples and followers of Jesus, we are created for that. And yet so many of us, like you said, we fall short in that we don't dream big enough. We don't think about multiplication. We don't see that God really can use us to make disciples who make disciples and see the multiplication of his kingdom in a broader sphere than what we ever dreamed before.
Yeah. Well, I so appreciate your encouragement and gracious challenge, I think, to invite people find their place in this story. Also, I'd encourage people to check out Faith to Move Mountains by C. Anderson. You can find it easily on Amazon.com. Anywhere else? Your websites, I imagine.
Yeah, on the website.
Links to it. Yeah, missionarylife.org. But if you just search Faith to Move Mountains Anderson or C. Anderson, you're going to find it easily. I was just there the other day, so I know. But thank you so much for coming on the show today, encouraging people to, not only catch a heartbeat, pulsation of God, and then join his mission, but to know that he's inviting them and wants to use them in this storyline. And that's exciting.
Well, thank you for having me. And I'm so encouraged to be able to share with others that God does use ordinary people.
Yeah.
And for the missionaries who are watching, because I know Missions Pulse reaches a lot of missionaries, I think he has greater things ahead. Amen. We're here at the beginning of the year, and really want to encourage you and everyone to dream with God for the amazing things he has ahead, and to be inspired with the faith and hope that he can use you. Sometimes I think in missions we get a little bogged down, the mundane, like you said, the buying vegetables in the market,
Yeah.
raising kids, homeschooling. I've done all that, but
Yes.
that God really can use us to do something significant
Sure,
and
yes.
impactful on the mission field and in our day. It's it's a great day to be a missionary. It's a
Yes.
great day to be a disciple maker and a follower
Absolutely.
of Jesus. Things that we never dreamed would happen are happening today.
Hmm.
And so really excited. Thanks for having me on the show, David.
It is my honor. Thank you so much.
Missions Pulse. Know God's heart, join His mission. This podcast is powered by Within Reach Global. Subscribe, watch, and listen on YouTube today. Visit missionspulse.com.